That's a really interesting question because um, I'm in thinking back over my life in music. I realise I've done a lot of things which people would say, well, how come you did that when you used to do that? So it seems like I have had a particularly sort of varied things I've been asked to do stylistically, and I suppose they come from just loving everything and adhering to that thing that Duke Ellington once said about, you know, there are two types of music. There's good music and there's bad music, and not being ever very tribal about it. There have been times when one's been expected to be very tribal about it, and it's almost like you're uncool if you're not. And one of those times I remember was when punk happened, because I was already a reasonably accomplished guitar player before punk. So I was into American bands and Little Feat and listening to all this, and Bad Company, and listening to all this rock music and Led Zeppelin and stuff. And then suddenly, when punk arrived and you were in a band, you had to sort of pretend not to, it was like the year zero, you had to pretend to not care for any of that anymore. And this was like a reinvention of music by people who couldn't play.
Well, the first thing I was into was Chick Corea, because I loved the drummer, Dave Weckl. I was just like, Dave Weckl was, I didn't even think the things he was doing was possible. And because I hadn't seen him play, especially when, you know, ghost notes on the drums, I thought that was impossible, and I couldn't figure out how he was doing it. So I had a snare drum with the black spot in the middle. So I used to get my stick and just rub it backwards and forwards and say, this is how he's getting that sound, this is how he's doing it. So I used to play and do that and then try and play doing that at the same time, and that's how I thought it was done. But obviously later on I found out, oh yeah, it's a kind of rudiment thing and that's how you do it. But yeah, Chick Corea was somebody I was really influenced by. I like that whole Return to Forever album. Lenny White, oh man, he's amazing too. So we were influenced by that, and because it was really musical and things were in different time signatures, and when I was playing music, we were playing in 7/8, 6/8, 13. It was just crazy. I don't think we hardly did any songs in 4/4, and if they were in 4/4, they didn't sound like they were in 4/4. So that was when I was like almost wanted to be the best drummer in the world. Do you know what I mean? That was that phrase. And then obviously, you know, you go to school and then you listen to hip hop, and I really got into hip hop. And then we used to mix that and fuse that together, because we used to play jazz fusion. So we mixed hip hop and our influences that we listened to, reggae, you know, whatever, we would put that into our music. So it became a bit more commercial, but it was still crazy. You know what I mean? The band was called Quite Sane, and we played, it was like my apprenticeship of music, do you know what I mean? Because I had to really play hard stuff. Everything was so complicated. Like the stuff I play now is nothing compared to what I used to play when we was like, must have been about 18, you know, doing stuff like that. It was nothing like, it was just so complicated. If I didn't practice, we practiced every day. And if I didn't do that, I wouldn't be able to play the songs.
A band that was influential to me in terms of gig going was a band called It Bites. And they came out in a kind of fallow period for progressive rock in the sort of later 1980s. So in prog rock terms, you had the kind of classic 70s bands. They all started to fall apart in the late 70s. Then you had a sort of new wave of bands, and that kind of started to fall apart in the mid 80s, really. And then you had a band called It Bites coming out. And I remember my friends saying, you've got to listen to this band. And the only thing I'd heard was a single called Calling All the Heroes, which didn't sound anything other than a sort of a good sort of rock pop song. But live, they were a completely different beast. You know, they were a very technically able band, particularly Francis Dunnery on guitar and John Beck on keyboards, really flying players, really incredible musicians. And I spent a huge amount of a couple of years really following them around the country, and I went to their fan convention in London and saw loads and loads of shows. And you know, I was, you know, I was in awe of them. Really, they were a fantastic live band, and it broke my heart when they split up. They seemed to me to be on the cusp of something quite big. You know, I think I saw them at Shepherd's Bush Empire or something just before they split up with my mate Richard, and we both walked out and said, wow, this is, you know, we can see them being the new Queen or something. And you know, we were passionate about them because they were kind of doing the sort of music that we liked, but you know, it was interesting music, it was beautifully played, but there were, I think, personnel issues in the band, and it sort of fell apart. And then, but they were an influence on, you know, my later music in Big Big Train. Certainly when we first started off, It Bites was a template for us, really, because they were, you know, a huge part of my life for a couple of years.
So for me, the initial genre was definitely heavy rock music. That was, you know, that's what I guess from Queen, then moving into that whole, you know, the magazine's Kerrang that had all those bands. So I was obsessive. I used to draw bands and, you know, the rigs and stuff like that. And so, yeah, totally into rock music. In fact, anyone who knew me from at school, you know, that was my big thing. In fact, I used to kind of always be imagining playing guitar. So, yeah, so it was rock music, AC/DC, all that, Led Zeppelin, and then as I went on, I started getting more into the Pink Floyds, you know, and then by the time I was 17, 18, then it went into that crossover of kind of more jazz influenced rock stuff with it. So, but yeah, initially absolutely was the rock thing. And my first gigs, I remember going to the Gaumont a lot, and then going to Donington and you know, to the festivals to see the bands, you know. So yeah, I was very much from that sort of background. It's amazing that all those big bands used to go to Ipswich, you know. So I've seen Kiss played there, Def Leppard obviously, Bon Jovi, they played there, you know. So all these bands used to tour. It's changed a lot, but that venue used to have so many bands going. So yeah, that was pretty much where I got the feeling that that's what I want to do, is to do music by going to those gigs, really.
I was born in 1965, so I was exposed to a lot of kind of music, kind of you know, subliminally, I guess, you know, through listening to things on radio, and it's such an exciting time in music in that era. So by the time I'm 10 years old in 1975, and by that time I'm starting to make choices about the types of music I like. And if you think about the 1970s as a period, you've got rock music in there, you've got pop music in there, you've got ska going and reggae, you know, you've got two-tone turning up, you've got electronica, you've got disco, you've got all sorts of stuff. There's, you know, almost, it seemed like there's another new thing coming out every week. And I remember at my school they had a sports centre, and it started housing bands, and around that time they had Slade play there. They had the Two-Tone Store, the Specials, so you got that. Bow Wow Wow played, I'm trying to think what's played there. Tigers of Pantang, Saxon. So you got the kind of the new wave of British heavy metal bands playing, but also things like Two-Tone scene. So to me, all that stuff was just, it was just anything good of its kind, you know, good music, you know. So it was, yeah, I guess I identified with a new wave of British heavy metal because that was kind of being targeted. It had people, ex-Deep Purple members in different bands, and, you know, Blackmore's Rainbow and all this business, and Gillan and bands like that, and Whitesnake, of course. The prog stuff would be stuff that I kind of discovered by going into Select Disc, which was a shop at that time, a really well-known record shop in Nottingham, and I'd go and I'd get my kind of pocket money or whatever, and or Saturday job money, go into Nottingham, go into the giveaways and kind of buy an album for like $1.99. And the prog albums always had very interesting covers. You know, they always looked quite ornate and beautiful objects. So I remember picking up things like Foxtrot for $1.99, a second-hand copy of that. That's a Genesis album made in 1972. And, you know, take these things home, and in those days, you know, to listen to music, it was a headphone experience, you know. So you get the album on, you're sitting in the armchair, headphones on, gatefold open, and off you go, you know, following the words, and suddenly you're immersed in this entire world. And I liked those sorts of sleeves, and I liked that kind of music, and I didn't really know it as progressive rock. It was just music that I liked. But obviously, as you get older, you get aware of genres and divisions.
I started off in playing a lot of rock music when I first started playing the first band I kind of worked professionally with. But through that, I met a bass player friend called Matt Hooper, who was a funk groove kind of guy, and I think he recognised something in me, God knows what. He recognised something in me, and we got together and started playing just like a rhythm section, bass and drums. And that was very much kind of funk and groove. And from that, I joined a band with Matt called the Soul Immigrants, which was very much the funk, acid, jazz, groove scene. So that was the first kind of scene that I was part of, I suppose. And I toured a lot around Europe with that band, especially Germany, who had a really good kind of funk and acid jazz scene. And through that scene, I remember I was quite young, about around 20, I think. That was the first genre of music I really started to feel like I was getting stretched. I was starting to play with other great musicians, virtuoso guys, and as a young musician, that's exactly what you want. You want to go and play with people that are much, much better than you, with much more experience. So being part of that acid, jazz, funk genre, that scene was awesome. You know, I learnt a hell of a lot. It was also one of the first times I started to settle musically. Funk music made a lot of sense to me, and playing a groove and playing something that would get an audience moving and get a vibe going and get a whole room shaking and moving to what you're doing. It's like a drug. That was really, really special for me at that point. Because essentially you could stop. I mean, you could stop any part of the band and the people would still dance. But if you stop anything and just leave the drums going, people and you're playing it right, of course. If you play it badly, the dance floor's going to be empty. No one wants to play to a crap drummer. So I learned that quite quickly. I learned to adapt what I did in certain circumstances to the audience, understand what makes them move, what doesn't make them move. And people don't often understand why something does make them want to dance, why something doesn't. They just innately know, man, this isn't grooving, it's not swinging, and they don't want to move. If you get it right, you can't help yourself. Well, I can't anyway. If something's swinging and grooving away, I want to move. Even though I move ridiculously badly.
We get you to do some dancing.
Yeah. No. It's hideous.
I think it was actually making music that led me into different genres. So I started just making music on the piano, and then realised there's this whole thing called electronic music, but didn't really know many artists or much of it. But my parents bought me a computer just to record the piano compositions originally. But then suddenly I noticed in the software you could edit audio as well as input MIDI information. I realised it was possible to edit sounds and get to the molecular structure of sound itself as well as the traditional ways I thought of music up until that point. So then I just started exploring loads of electronic artists who are doing that to a really interesting degree. I think the first guys after Jean-Michel Jarre and Tangerine Dream and Vangelis and the 70s lot were Autechre, Aphex Twin, Plaid, and the whole Warp Records scene.
Yes. Rather embarrassingly, I would probably say that when I went to Clarendon College of Music when I was 16, which is in Nottingham. I'm from Mansfield, and the school in Mansfield had no real music facilities. So I went to a specialist college with a great music department. And we always used to just gather around this grand piano in the main hall at lunch times. It's a bit like Fame, you know, when everybody just goes into the cafeteria and it breaks into song.
On the cars and all.
That kind of, yeah, not so much the cars, but I just remember that I just loved, wait for it, Barry Manilow.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, not that I could sing like Barry, and not that I have the nose like Barry either, but we used to just go in and play, you know, Oh Mandy and I Write the Songs and Could It Be Magic and anything like that. We just sing and a bit like a kind of student karaoke around a piano thing.
I've never really subscribed to that kind of tribal thing, where if you like that, you look like this and you listen to that. I've always kind of I like good things of its kind. You know, so I'm quite happy to listen. If it's a good disco record, if it's a good reggae record, it's a good, it's not kind of, I can't listen to that. Yeah. Not in these shoes. You know, I can't do that. How dare you? There's none of that. To me, anything good of its kind was the kind of the rule of thumb, really. Yeah. And I've applied that to everything else since. If I like it, I like it. If I don't, then I'll find something else that I do. You know, and there's plenty of good music out there still. But it was an odd thing because with the music industry, at that time, you'd get magazines like Sounds, Melody Maker, New Musical Express, those sorts of things, and there'd be a scene happening somewhere out there. Because in Nottingham, it's the Midlands, and it's a bit like if you imagine that England's a pond, and these events would happen, and this huge stone would be dropped in these shockwaves would drop in the middle, like boom, and then the ripples go out. Well, by the time they get to sort of Midlands, and further north, it's slower. So change is less rapid, I guess. That's the way it used to be.
So it was uncool to be able to play, and and I went along with that a little bit. I was in bands, I understand the aesthetic of it now much more than I did. How, there's this massive sliding scale between technique and technical ability. So you can be really good at something, or you can not know anything about what you're doing, but it still crosses over what you're able to say with that and how it affects people. In other words, what I'm trying to say is you can be a very rudimentary, primitive musician, but still be an enormous success if you have the right attitude and the way to communicate. Or conversely, you can be the best virtuoso musician in the world and not say crap with it because people don't really get what you're doing. There's a big area, particularly in the self-taught thing about pop music or rock music or whatever, where that exists. So I might not listen to Yngwie Malmsteen playing 1,000 notes a second. I might not get anything from that at all, personally, and yet I can hear Neil Young do a one-note guitar solo, and I'm on the floor going, "Oh, that is so beautiful." So it's that big spectrum, and I think I've taken that in my career, so I can play with funk bands, and I've played with reggae bands, and I've played with heavy metal bands, and so that whole thing, I love it all really. So I'm lucky in not having had to stick with one thing and say he's associated with that. Let's only get him for that. So it's quite yeah. So I've always had a broad appreciation of it all, I think.
I'm not really much of a live musician myself, but I remember we did an acoustic show up in Cumbria, and it was Francis Dunnery that invited us to play, and John Mitchell was there as well. And I remember there was a moment where I was, shuffled on stage, feeling uncomfortable and self-conscious, and playing acoustic guitar. And I looked to my left, and there was Francis Dunnery, stood no further away than you are, watching. And I looked to my right, and John Mitchell was stood, and I just thought, I'm in an it-bite sandwich here, And it was one of those moments where I thought, crikey, these guys were absolutely my idols, and and they're sort of stood watching and presumably enjoying our set. So that was quite good fun.
How did you get on with that? Were you starstruck, and did it make you nervous while you were playing?
I'm not a performer anyway, so my job in Big Train is as a songwriter. There are many of us in the band that write tunes now, but that's still my core role, and it's what I enjoy doing the most. So the performing side is something I've kind of had to do, because being a musician, you're expected to perform, and that's what I do. But I kind of shuffle on stage slightly reluctantly, and I'm surrounded by talented people that can take that pressure off, and therefore I can just, enjoy it as much as I can, and enjoy. Well, certainly I can't pretend that I don't enjoy the interaction with the audience, etc. So in the moment, it's great fun. I kind of dread it looking up to it. The thing. In Cumbria, it was an intimate show. It was a different show for us. Nobody really knew who we were, and so we had to sort of win over an unknown audience, because it was a sort of charity thing. So it was good, a good experience for us, because up to then we'd only really played in front of the fan base. So it was a different feel for me. But yeah, it was just one of those moments where, because It Bites was so important to me, it was just kind of pinch me moment. Really, it was wow. Is cool. So
in Nottingham, there wasn't a factory records like there was in Manchester, or there wasn't like the Birmingham music scene's got its venues, its agents, its way out. There didn't seem to be anything like that in Nottingham. So you'd have good bands kind of appearing out of nowhere, and there's bands like the Fairground. I really loved. I used to go and watch this band called Fairground play, a bit like Echo and the Bunnymen, that type of thing. There were a good band called Up as well, Nottingham band called Sense, who I did a bit of work with at one point. But all these bands wouldn't really have any outlet. I think Sense had a record label, had a record deal with Corea Records, which is a French label. But it's very few and far between. The idea was, it seemed to be this untouchable thing that happened, and the music business was something that kind of happened elsewhere. I always felt like I wasn't kind of in the music business, because it's somewhere out there. It's this place where I'm not. It's this like golden castle or something like that. It feels like it's something remote that only the great and the good go through. Yeah. So the idea at that time of actually making music and having it released on as a format, like a 7-inch single or an album, it was such an expensive process to do that. You know, you couldn't kind of do it off your own bat at that point. It was too expensive. You know, it was, you know, it was just beyond the reach of most people. You'd need record company intervention, and for Nottingham musicians, there was no outlet. So that's why I and my colleagues, there's my peers in Nottingham would be. There's a band called Tindersticks. They were kind of, if you like, peers of mine. They went away from Nottingham to become more successful.
I'd never used to really practice, so I was never going to be a concert pianist because I was too lazy. I always used to practice the bare minimum to pass the exam that was ahead of me. So I always then went into more of the light music and the songs, and that's probably why I ended up moving into theatre as well, because I was never going to be able to play the Rachmaninoff Second Piano Concerto, basically. So Barry Manilow, student karaoke.
Well, I eventually got to music college in England, and at the Royal Northern they had a very good scheme where they there were a lot of visiting artists of lots of different genres, and as students we got free tickets, which was great. So I went to a Wayne Shorter concert, which was amazing. Absolutely loved it. And it was completely mind-blowing, and you know, I was completely in the classical tradition. I think the only thing out of that was my mum used to listen to Hawaiian folk music.
Okay. Interesting.
And Austrian yodeling, you know.
Right, okay. Quite an eclectic mix of things then.
Well, quite weird, yeah. Yeah, but listening to Wayne Shorter was just an incredible experience. It was very influential because from that time I started being really interested in jazz, and after college I moved down to London and I started exploring jazz musicians in London, trying to find a jazz workshop that I could play with a violin, which was really hard.
Yeah, I bet.
Being a woman in that environment, it's a very male environment then.
And violin in jazz doesn't strike me
exactly.
as something that's, you don't often see it together.
No, it was a sort of 10 or 15 year journey of kind of defining what can you do with a violin in jazz.
And did you find it?
I found my own way. I found a way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and really by listening and finding other violinists who'd done it many years ago. Stuff Smith is a great role model for me because his playing is extraordinarily rhythmic and really deeply groovy, and you know, he sometimes doesn't pay attention to the harmony at all, but he knows what's going on, but it's like he's far too interested in what's happening rhythmically, and it's great.
I think most people, if they dip their toes into kind of making music, it stays with you. Yeah. Regardless whether you're playing to, you know, 2 people, 100,000 people, or you leave it in your bedroom. Yeah. There's something about music that nothing else has. It's a magical hold on you, and expressing yourself in music, which is what I ultimately do now. There's nothing like that. Still, you know, even sitting here talking to you about it, I've been interviewed before, and whenever I start talking about what it feels like to play music, I always get animated and excited, and it's just fantastic. I love it. And that started with that band. Yeah. So.
Prog. What is prog?
Oh no! Don't go there.
No, I don't think so.
No, I think we covered most of them.